So we're going to talk today about the Stop the Bleed program and specifically bleeding control techniques. One of the things that we've learned as first responders, paramedics, firefighters, police officers, is that the people who are going to have the greatest impact and make the biggest difference in a severe bleeding situation are really just the people who are around. You can bleed to death from severe bleeding in as little as 3 to 5 minutes. Being able to use these tools to be able to stop the bleed is really, really important. So that's why we're here today. So first of all, recognizing severe bleeding and understanding what severe bleeding looks like is really important. So if you have a large wound where you have bleeding that is spurting out of the wound, that's fairly obvious as severe bleeding and life-threatening bleeding as well. So if you have something that's spurting, that's something that you need to intervene with immediately. If you have blood that just won't stop coming out of the wound, that's also severe and needs to be treated as well. Anytime that you have clothing that's soaked in blood, that would be considered severe bleeding, or pooling on the ground, pooling of blood on the ground would be severe bleeding as well. So recognizing those things is the first step, and then intervening is the second. If we're talking about an extremity, the best way to deal with that is one of these tourniquets. And these are military grade, military style tourniquets that are adapted for civilian use. The science and technology behind these, it's not like the tourniquets that you learn maybe in the Boy Scouts. There's a little bit more data behind these to show that they actually do work and they actually do control bleeding. So we want to stay away from any sort of improvised tourniquets and only use these specified tourniquets if you're going to use these to stop bleeding. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to just open this up, and if you're applying a tourniquet to yourself, the application process is fairly simple, and all you're really going to do is put this on high, and you're going to put it on tight, and you're going to just pull this strap here. You're going to pull this thing around, and then once I've got that nice and tight, I'm just going to turn this windlass here a couple of times. I've got that a little low, so I'll flip it up just a little bit there. And you want to get this at least 2 to 3 inches above wherever the wound site is, but we like to practice just high and tight, because the higher you get this, the more bleeding that you're going to stop, and we don't want to confuse people too much with where to go. Just above the site and high and tight is what we want to tell people. And then you're going to turn this windlass until bleeding stops. And then once we have bleeding controlled, then we're going to go ahead and thread this through, and it's really, really a simple process, especially if you're putting it on somebody else and you have 2 hands to work with. They are a little bit painful, and we've had people say that the tourniquet ends up hurting a little bit worse than the wound sometimes, but it's life over limb, and it will help save your life in these situations where we have severe bleeding. If you don't have one of these very specific tourniquets, and we're hoping that there does come a time where these are readily accessible in public places and in malls and in shopping centers and things like that. We're getting to that point where you may see these in more places, and you may be able to respond and help somebody out and use one of these tourniquets, or maybe you'll carry one of these yourself at some point. But we're not quite there yet, and we recognize that. So if you don't have one of these specified tourniquets, the combat application tourniquet specifically is what we recommend. If you don't have one of these, then what we do recommend is wound packing. And so when you have a large vessel wound, if you have a large extremity wound, or a large wound to the neck or the groin that is severely bleeding, what we want you to do is we want you to apply pressure to that wound. And you can do this, so if you have some sort of a dressing in a trauma kit or something like that, great. We would assume if you had a trauma kit, you would also have dressing. In the situation where you don't have a trauma tourniquet, we would say don't apply a makeshift tourniquet. Belts and things like this, lanyards and other devices, they're sometimes not strong enough to apply the necessary pressure, and the trauma surgeons are finding that they can actually cause more damage or more harm in some of the situations by adding more pressure to the wound. And so we would say stay away from makeshift tourniquets and go straight to wound packing and direct pressure. And so when we're talking about wound packing, I have gauze here, but really you can use anything. You can use socks, you can use your shirt, you can use any sort of absorbent material that you can find in a situation where you have somebody bleeding. And I would say don't worry necessarily about If it's really, really dirty, you know, the person is going to get antibiotics, and the trauma surgeons would much rather you get them there alive with their blood volume intact rather than worry about getting some dirt into a wound. So don't worry about that too much. I'm going to just spread this just a little bit to show basically what we're going for when you're doing the wound packing. You would do a quick wipe just to see if you can see where the bleeding is coming from, and then you're just going to put the wound, the material down in there. And I'm demonstrating this with one hand and of course with no gloves, but in a situation where you were helping somebody, you would want to have gloves on if you can. If not, then that's, you know, you're going to have to judge that for yourself of whether you want to get involved in that situation. I can tell you from my personal experience, if I have somebody who's bleeding and I'm off duty, I'm more likely to help them than I'm not. And so you're just basically going to keep pushing this material down in there, whatever the material is, until you feel like you've got that down to the bottom of the wound, you've filled up the wound, and then you're going to hold pressure. And you're going to hold that pressure until the paramedics arrive and they're able to either apply a tourniquet or take that pressure over for you. Don't peek at it to see if it stopped bleeding. That'll stop the clotting process, and just hold that thing down. And you can really have a huge impact here just by applying pressure to a wound to stop bleeding and hopefully save a life. You know, we've gone over some of the basics of bleeding control. We've talked about some tourniquets and tourniquet application. We've talked about some wound packing and direct pressure. And really, you know, this is the first steps into learning more about the Stop the Bleed program and taking a bleeding control course. And I would really recommend that everybody take a Stop the Bleed course. And so, you know, it's about an hour-long course. It takes you through recognizing that severe bleeding, and it gives you the confidence to be able to intervene when you see somebody who's in a situation where there's serious, severe bleeding and they're at risk for disability or death. So I would really recommend somebody go and take this course. For the folks that are interested in buying these tourniquets, you can go to North American Rescue, and that's narescue.com. That's where the paramedics in the city here buy their tourniquets from, the police officers and everybody else. That's where we supply from. So that would be our recommendation, is to use a certified company that sells these. And then as far as bleeding control kits, they have kits that have actual clotting gauze in there and everything else. So that would be our recommendations. Take a bleeding control class and maybe supply yourself with some of this stuff, and certainly be able to intervene when you see somebody who's in trouble.